My name is Michael McGirr, and you haven't come to listen to me, you've come to listen to Andrew O'Hagan. Andrew is such a good writer, he could have been born in Melbourne, but he wasn't. Born in Scotland, 1968, and it may be rude to mention the year someone's born, except that in different parts of Andrew's writing, he does mention that that was a particularly significant year to be born, the things happening in the world and so on. Author of this pile of terrific books right here. And the most recent book that Andrew has written is called The Life and Opinions of Moff the Dog and of His Friend, Marilyn Monroe. And I'll just start by asking Andrew about that particular book. Tell us, we've all heard of Marilyn Monroe, but who is Moff the Dog?
Apart from being me, you mean? Moff the Dog was a dog that was given to Marilyn by Frank Sinatra in 1960. I knew about this dog from having had a misspent youth. Obviously, when I wasn't sniffing glue and dogging school, I was reading about Marilyn Monroe. I read a lot about Marilyn Monroe quite young, and by the time I got to a certain point in my career where I knew I wanted to write a comedy, it had been boiling in me for quite a long time, the idea of writing a comedy. So I knew about this dog, and I happened to be in New York, and there was a sale at Christie's of Marilyn Monroe's personal belongings. Some of you will remember that sale. It was a famous sale at the time where it was a kind of madhouse, actually. There were lots of society people in New York fighting with each other to get to her leavings, really. I mean, there was bits of lipsticks and scripts and dresses and pots and pans of Marilyn's that were being sold off. But in among all the stuff, there was 6 little Polaroids of this dog called Moff the Dog. She called it Mafia Honey as a joke about Sinatra's alleged, I think they say, mafia connections. So Mafia Honey was with her for the last 2 years of her life, and I realised that if you could get a grip on this dog's story and you could begin to impersonate the voice of this dog, then you might have a funny, insightful book about the American century, about the 20th century itself, because there was Marilyn right at the cusp of the 60s, a moment of the permissive society was up in front of her, feminism was in front of her, the space age was just in front of her. She was right on the brink of a real change in society, and I thought, this dog witnessed it all. It was there during the Kennedy years, there during her psychoanalytic sessions, and the absurd thing was that the more I looked into the dog's life, the more I discovered that it was actually such that you couldn't make it up. The dog had been given to her by Frank Sinatra, who'd been given it by Natalie Wood's mother, who got dogs from England, and she got it from the house of the painters Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell. It's Virginia Woolf's sister, you know, the painter. And so the dog started its life, not there though, it was brought to the house in Sussex from a farm in Scotland. And that just made me, I remember the day I discovered that, I sort of jumped out of the chair with excitement. Because I thought, great, I can make him more close to the language and the landscape that really matters to me.
This dog is truly a remarkable character and a great device, because it's interesting hearing Andrew saying it was a window on the American century, because this is a very funny book, but it's also a book which is a feast of ideas, and it goes everywhere. There's many moments in the book at which Andrew touches upon the role of dogs in the history of philosophy and the history of thought, and dogs that have belonged to other famous writers. How did you get a handle on not just this dog, but all those other dogs?
Well, it's a problem, actually. I don't think I'll ever do that again. You know, write a book where the narrator of the book is much cleverer than you are. Problem. I spent a lot of years researching it, basically, and the fact was that I wanted the dog to be really persuasive, you know, that you might start the book thinking, dog narrates a book, really, I mean, come on. But by, I'd hoped, page 5 or 6, you'd be absolutely convinced. That's what fiction has always been about for me. It's about, you know, persuading you that your capacity for wonder, that your imagination is as big as it comes. And it's almost complimenting the reader, I think, to allow them to access the magic in their own head. And I think by page 5 or 6, if this works, then you've actually forgotten that it's illogical to have a dog narrating a book. You're completely with him. You care about him. You're irritated by him. You take on some of his prejudices. And one of the ways to do that, I thought, was to have him be incredibly knowledgeable about that great feast of animals in literature, going all the way back to the beginning of literature. And of course, I grew up in Scotland with a strong tradition of that. I grew up in Ayrshire, where Robert Burns and his influence are still incredibly strong. And I was growing up, I loved reading Robert Burns, and the language came to be part of our language. I just felt it was there all the time. And of course, one of the devices he had was to often write political satire in the voices of animals. There's the famous Twa Dogs, where two dogs are discussing the bad character of the local landlord when they meet on the road. There's other poems of his, like the death and dying words of poor Maillie, narrated by a sheep. That's particularly good, I thought. And then, of course, even when he's not speaking in the voice of the dog, he's writing about animals with such empathy that it reminds you that part of our task as human beings is to realise that the world is populated with creatures who deserve imagining, deserve a place on the planet. And I really wanted to take that on. That poem of his to a mouse, "Wee, poor, coor and timorous beastie, oh, what a panic's in thy breastie." I mean, we got that at school. And never for a second did you think, why is this guy paying attention to a mouse in the field? It just seemed like the very essence of what literary creation was all about.
Now, you need to be careful, Andrew, because if you start, I think there'll be people here who want to hear you read Robert Burns all night, because it just sounded like it should sound. Not the way we were taught at school. We speak about... not quite the same when you have a very Australian teacher teaching it.
You hear it when I've got a drink in me.
But just to step sideways for a moment, Robert Burns does appear a fair bit in your books, but so does another writer, John Galt, who, excuse my ignorance, but I didn't know very much about him. But tell us a little bit about John Galt.
He's been forgotten. This was what can happen if part of our job should be to try and keep literary traditions alive. There's a lot of Indigenous traditions in Australia too that you need to keep an eye on them. There's a lot of parts of life which are always under-described, and it's the job not just of writers but of readers to make sure that that great compendious life out there finds its way onto the page. And John Galt, he won't be out of print for long because I'm bringing him back into print for Penguin Classics. I'm editing a series of 3 short novels and introducing notes and stuff, if I ever find any time from touring around Australia. But the thing is that he was a writer in the 1820s. He was the best political writer of his time. His most famous book is probably called Annals of the Parish. And he has this central character who's just like an ironic sort of idiot of a man, who's he's full of lies and delusions, but also humanness. He's like Holy Willie in Holy Willie's Prayer, just a kind of one of those characters that you can sympathise with and be appalled by at the same time. My favourite kind of person.
Well, I'll certainly be looking out for those new editions because having read in your books about John Galt, my immediate reaction, and I think you're responding to that, is where can I get my hands on these books? Just going back to Moff the Dog for a moment, I spent a little bit of the book wondering when JFK was going to finally appear, because in popular imagination, Marilyn Monroe and JFK are quite bound up together. And he does make an appearance in the book, not for very long, and got the impression that, at least as far as Moff the Dog is concerned, their relationship was not nearly as intense as people like to imagine it was.
One of the things that became obvious to me during the years of researching the book was that the Kennedy thing was a bit of a red herring. I know it's exciting for people to imagine that this glamorous pair of historical characters must have had the most immense affair. And they certainly had a night together. And that's important in itself, but the fact that they weren't some secret pair that went on for years together and sort of went behind the backs of their respective husbands and wives. It just isn't there. It's very easy to tell with a president where they were every minute of every day of their presidency. The records alone tell you that they didn't see that much of each other. They just couldn't have been in the same city. And you know where she was too. But people were so hungry for the idea of this mythological pairing, this great American dream pair, that they have written conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory, many of them just absolutely going beyond belief and suggesting that it was the Kennedys that murdered her and so on. Now, there is a lot of sort of dark stuff around Marilyn, around the Kennedys, but the Kennedys did not kill Marilyn Monroe. And I just wanted the dog to end up being a bit cynical about all that. And leaving it out in most cases. But there is a scene, of course, as you say, where they're together at a party.
But when they do come together, it is actually quite poignant, because it's really an encounter between two quite vulnerable people in a way, isn't it? May I just read a sentence or two? Sitting by this is when JFK and Marilyn Monroe are finally in the room together at this party. Sitting by the patio windows at Lawford's house, they seem to present such a heavenly coalition of natural accomplishments that no one could resist picturing them in each other's arms. This kind of thing gains force by desire and repetition. And those like me who like myths more than facts will enjoy the notion of Marilyn and the President together. Yet they were only in each other's company a few times. On each occasion talking about themselves and politics in a public room, enjoying a fondness that history would consecrate into something larger than life. And then just a little bit further down, her pretty blue eyes open to his Boston carefulness to tell him the thing that is concealed by fame. Gee, she said, what a question. You think the answer is private pain, don't you? Yes, I suppose you do. So it's really, I got the impression from that scene, here are two people very much at the mercy of a celebrity industry that wanted to, at the heart of which was this need to do something about private pain.
Yeah, well, he was in pain the whole time physically. I mean, he had such a back problem, and at that particular time it was almost, bringing him low. And her private pain, of course, has become legendary now. She was a very sad, trapped woman in those last years, especially of her life. So I wanted them to address that in that scene. Again, it's one of the things that you should hope fiction can do, is supply you with the material or the wherewithal to imagine parts of life which might have seemed a bit hidden before. It was all based on the research, everything in the book. I mean, the great joke for me was that this book, which was full of such, fantasies and such strangeness, talking dogs and talking bed bugs and cats that spoke only in poetry, and a vision of the world turned upside down in a way, that actually at heart it was a very human story. And it was actually about how people live their lives and how they cope with the legacy of the past. And in the context of all that, the joke for me was that nothing in the book would be made up, that I'd find evidence for everything that was said and done in the book. That caused some big moments of absurdity for me. When I was researching in Hollywood, I spent a lot of time up in Bel Air looking at the houses and interviewing people who knew Frank Sinatra and others. And at one moment, I was up there, I made a cardinal mistake, which was to park the car and walk. I'd forgotten temporarily that only serial killers and homeless people walk in Los Angeles. So I walked up the road, and I bent down because I wanted to see the houses that graduated up. It seemed great and amazing, and I wanted the dog to observe this in the book, that you look at the perfect copy of a Tuscan villa, and then just behind it's the perfect copy of an English cottage. And beyond that, there's the perfect French chateau. And it suddenly occurred to me, or occurred to Marv, because I was already thinking like a dog by that point. I began to think, Los Angeles, California as a whole is a fantastic part of the world, so long as you don't care about authenticity. And so I was thinking about that, and I was slightly crouched, taking notes about the house, and I felt a sort of hand on my shoulder, and I turned round, and it was two police officers. One of them said, "Can I see your driver's license, sir?" And
even though you were walking.
I looked for that, and you just assumed I must have a car somewhere. And he said, "Can I ask you what you're doing here?" And I said, "Well, you see, I'm a Scottish novelist, and I'm writing this book in the voice of Marilyn Monroe's dog, and just taking some notes about the place. And you've never seen two men reach for their handcuffs faster in your life." So I got into quite a lot of trouble trying to just research the book, but I wanted it all to be true in some sense.
But actually, that is an interesting picture of you on the streets of Los Angeles, because it leads me to my next thing about this book, which is that it is in such different, or on such different turf than your other books, most of which are set in Scotland and deal with people who struggle in different ways, and some of them pretty close to the edge, socially and financially. And yet here's a book which is set in the world of Sinatra and Marilyn Monroe and JFK and what we look back on as glamour and tinsel and so on. So what took you here at that level? What drew you to that particular?
I think in a surface way it's very, very different. You know, it's obviously a different location. It's a different climate in this novel altogether. You know, the talking animals, the sense of fun in this book, the sense of discovery of worlds that might not be obvious to the naked eye. But in many other respects, it's like my other books. You know, the narrator is Scottish, albeit a Maltese terrier rather than somebody born in Glasgow. And the concerns in the book are quite close to, you know, a tradition in Scottish literature of looking to explain humanness, trying to explain morality. How do we live? You know, and what's the comedy of errors that surrounds our lives? And to home in on that specifically in the native voice, to make the particular universal. That has always been my intention, and this book is part of that plan. It's just that, you know, the cinematography of this book is so vivid and so different. But I certainly felt when I was writing it that it was quite close to what I'd been heading towards all my life. Those earlier books of mine are quite somber in many ways. They have comedy in them, but you need to look hard for it. And the books are tragic in some way. But I think if you grow up looking at the best examples, whether it be Dickens or Shakespeare or Robert Burns, what you find is that tragedy and comedy, they don't live in different universes. They live in the same place at the same time. Sometimes in our lives, tragedy and comedy can follow so hard on the heels of each other in the one day, within the 1 hour, even within the 1 minute, that it can make your head spin. They are opposing sides of the same coin, tragedy and comedy, and the novelist's job is to spin that coin on the table so that you, the reader, can pick it up and feel some sort of investment, some sort of involvement in your own lives. I think that's the job, and so I never hesitated for a second. As soon as I saw that what I was writing was a comedy, I was delighted. I didn't think, this isn't like my other books, I better stop. You know.
Well, thank you for that explanation, and it is it's a joyous book, but also poignant, and I think everybody would vouch for that. What you're saying about tragedy and comedy, that's what humanity is. We're, you know, the funniest and the saddest all on the same day, aren't we? And do you mind if we take a walk back through your career before Moff the Dog and look at some of the other things that you've done? It's quite quite a range of interests and things that you've written about. You have a book of essays called Atlantic Ocean, and in it is an essay that you published, I think, in 1993 about James Bulger, the little boy people will remember, who was very sadly killed by two 10-year-olds. And am I right in thinking that that particular essay was a kind of a certain kind of starting point for you? It's the oldest one in this collection, isn't it?
It was a coming out, that essay, I have to say. You know, that was in 1993, and as many of you might remember, that was a massive case in the UK. The murder of James Bulger by those two 10-year-old boys in Liverpool resonated right through the society and struck a chord of fear into the heart of every parent and every member of society, I think. What happened was, I was very young then. I think I was 23 at that point, or 25 at most. And what happened was that all the newspapers in Britain I thought they showed an incredible level of moral stupidity when it came to that case. I didn't know much, but I knew that those headlines saying "hang them" on the front page of The Sun, or "devil dogs" on the front page of the Daily Mail, saying that those boys should have been assassinated, seemed to me an example of a society at its worst state of incomprehension, that these boys' lives had been wrecked by their action. That in some sense a civilised society should have found a way to come in and protect them, which to some extent it tried to do later. But at the time of the trial, there was a frenzy of hatred. There was a mob mentality, and you may remember the vans that brought them to Preston Crown Court were being banged on by the side by grown men holding up nooses. There was 2 10-year-old children in that van. So I was so exercised about it that I said to my editor, I was working in the London Review of Books at the time, and I asked if I could go take the day off because I had an essay to write that I thought that would be good for the paper. And so I went home that day and then stayed up for 2 days entirely through the night and the whole day without looking up, just smoking cigarettes and drinking water. And at the end of that, I came out with this essay, and it was about our childhoods growing up in Ayrshire, where it was whatever else it was, and there was a lot of fantastic things about growing up there, but it was rough. And I wanted to get that roughness onto the page and describe a state of childhood that wasn't just about innocence and the wonders of the childish imagination, but also about the difficulties of childhood. So I wrote that essay, and it was an amazing experience because the essay was published on a Monday, and by the Wednesday it had been republished and so many newspapers and featured in so many news programmes that I was sort of overwhelmed by the sort of flashlight of it.
And you went in a direction in that essay that few others did, which is that most people were baying for blood, a few were asking other questions, but you actually went to a place of self-examination, that describing your own childhood and how actually, whilst you'd never done anything quite like that some of the things that happened in your childhood were, pretty scary too.
Well, I thought it was important to make the personal investment in that essay, to give the reader an actual insight into childhood. I was obviously closer to my childhood then than I am now, but I was so close to it in my head that I was able to reproduce the images from that housing estate that we grew up in. And I came from a big family. There was a lot of sort of, there was just a lot of, easy behaviour. We didn't come from a middle-class background where everybody sort of thought about whether the children were sort of eating their greens and paying attention to their homework. It was much more chaotic than that, sometimes to great effect, but I wanted to try and get the darker side of that onto the page. And in that essay, I hadn't expected anything like the result. The result was that overnight there was a sort of beam turned onto the idea of, is childhood innocence just a kind of little indulgence that we all have? We think children are, just, innocent and grey and have only goodness in them, when in fact maybe they have something profoundly selfish and savage in them unless we socialise them out of it. Certainly the way that those boys were treated was scandalous, and the Prime Minister at the time, John Major, uttered a sentence which I think is the most evil sentence I've ever heard come out of a Prime Minister's mouth, unless you're willing to include or exclude Margaret Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society. That was quite evil. But more evil than that, I think, was John Major saying about the Bulger case, I think it's time for us to understand a bit less and condemn a bit more. He therefore gave licence to those nutcases who wanted to kill those children. And it was nothing but a sad case where there were really 3 victims in the end, not just one. And as a society, if you don't try and understand the wickedness and the horrors that exist within your compass, then that's a society not doing its best.
And that case all came up a year or two ago when Thompson and Venables reached their 18th birthday, and it didn't seem like the world had matured very much by that stage. But moving on from that particular essay, I can see a kind of path from there to your first book, which was a work of non-fiction called The Missing. And this is, it's a personal book at one level, which describes quite a lot about your family and people who've gone missing in certain ways in your family, but also broader than that. Can you tell us a little bit about where this book came from?
It wasn't so much my family as people in the community where I grew up. You know, there had been some children went missing in the 1970s, and it had always slightly haunted me, the idea that there was no explanation. There was a boy called Sandy Davison who went missing in a place called Irvine, which is very near where we grew up, in Burtree Hill. And that little boy's disappearance had such a dramatic impact on our sense of growing up. Some of us, especially for sensitive, bookish, weren't that many of them, but there was a couple. I was one of them, sadly. And it had an incredible impact. The teachers used to take us through the fields at playtime with sticks looking for him, which seems quite a sort of mad thing to do when I look back on it, but they were themselves. So there was a whole police hunt on, and they involved the whole community in looking for this little boy. He was never found. So when it came to writing The Missing, I wanted to try and step inside that great modern mystery of the missing person and try and light it up somehow. It was an incredible experience because researching that, I mean, it's a book I could never write now. You had to be young and guileless and I think childless to write that book. I think now I've got a 7-year-old daughter. The idea of sitting in living rooms talking to mothers who'd never see their children's faces again and just taking notes and keeping it together, that's something I just couldn't do now. It was heartbreaking, and it would be more heartbreaking now. There's certain books you write in your career that are just absolutely emerge out of a moment, an absolute moment in time and in a moment in your life as a writer, and that was one of them. That it was a book that is quite innocent in itself. It looks at this problem in society almost without panic, and I'm afraid to say that has gone from my own head as much as you can imagine.
But you're in the process, are you not, of bringing this book to the stage at the moment?
Yeah, there's, because Be Near Me, the novel previous to Moff the Dog, it became a play in the West End in London, and it had a great time. It was a very good adaptation, a very good production, and I had a lovely experience with that. And so they wanted to do a new play of mine, and so we're going to do The Missing. They had asked me to do it 15 years ago, and I said, I don't think I can face looking again at the stories and dwelling with that material again. It seemed so sad, but actually, because of what I said, that I've moved so far away from the person who wrote it, I thought I'd love to look at the original text again and just find a shape for it on the stage. And these people were very keen to do it. So it's now turned into a giant production because they're using, new technology and video screens and incredible troupe of actors. We've been casting it. So fantastic international actors going to be in this, and it's going to have a great experience, I hope. We're doing 7 weeks of rehearsal starting later in the year. But, it's funny with your books. I mean, people say, do you ever read your own books? And, of course, you don't. I mean, it's too... it's like you become so... Your attitude towards your books is a bit like your attitude towards your children. On the first day of school, you straighten their tie and, slick down their hair and kiss their cheek and send them out into the world, and you watch from the window just saying, be kind to them, and you worry for them and you hope the best for them, but you wouldn't want to follow them down the street, and go into and be waiting at the edge of the playground to see if the kids were being nice to them. You've got to let them go. So you don't read them again, but you do have this sort of parental feeling about them. And there's this excitement that comes when you hear that the books are out having a life that's colourful or joyful, or when books are becoming movies or stage plays, you're excited for them because you think that's more grist to that book's mill in some way. I want to give a shout out actually to a group in Melbourne. It's a reading group called the Bonn Writers Group, Readers Group, because they, some of them may be here tonight, and they've been going for 10 years, and they're named after the Bonn family in my first novel, Our Fathers. The family is run by Hugh Bonn, and that was the first book they did, and that was exciting. That's an example of a book having its life, so big shout out to the Bonn group.
Well, it's good to get onto that, because that is one of my favourites of your books, Our Fathers, and your first novel. What budged you from The Missing is extended non-fiction, and after that, this wonderful novel, truly wonderful novel, Our Fathers. Tell us about that step in your life into the first novel.
I knew I wanted to write this novel. I could hear a sort of echo in my head. It's very odd. Being a novelist is just, in a sense, like being a full-time self-diagnosed schizophrenic, where you hear voices and you have a sense of the possibility of a narrative, but you don't know what it is yet. So you're investigating it, and you wake up in the night and you hear characters' voices and you hear footsteps, and it's a very odd experience. You get used to it. Never entirely used to it, but you get so that you can live with it. And I heard the voice of this old man. I could tell that he was in a tower block. He was in the 18th floor of a tower block, and he was dying slowly. It was the end of his life. And I could hear this man shouting from the bedroom for his wife to bring in the tea. And suddenly around that voice, which I heard repeatedly, I'd be standing at the shaving mirror and I'd hear him speak, and I would sort of drop the razor and just sort of listen to it. And it was in my head. He came all the way up from my DNA. He came all the way up from my culture in Scotland, all the way up from my language, from my people, from the Catholics, from the people who'd moved from Ireland into Scotland and created a life and created a society and eventually created a way to be. It came from all those echoes, all those historical voices came sort of rising up through this man, and I could hear them, and the poetry of him and the thrum of his experience was in my ear at the shaving mirror or in bed at night. And finally I saw that this man, Hugh Bond, was the narrator of this, what I felt to be quite an epic story of how this house builder in Glasgow came to die in one of his own constructions. And that whole civic movement in Scotland to clear the slums, to clear Glasgow's slums and give people a new hope, which was the housing estates that we grew up in. I suddenly felt that all the life that mattered to me in my young years was there to be written about in that book, and it was a book that hadn't been written before.
Well, I'm not surprised to hear that it came from such deep passion, because so many scenes in it, and but not least the death scene of this builder, are just unforgettable. And I think people in Melbourne will relate strongly to this book too, because the period in which this chap Hugh Bourne was creating this high-rise public housing coincided with the time in Melbourne in which high-rise public housing was all the go here as well, and that's still part of our life. And there was a whole ethos that went with it, and phrases like slum clearance and the simplicity of those places. And even when Hugh, who was behind all this, eventually ends up on the 18th floor of one of these towers, and the lift's not working, and I think anybody who's had friends in the high-rise in Melbourne know that phrase, which means more in the high-rise than other places, oh, the lift's not working, because it means that old people near the top are not going to get out today, and so on and so forth. So I felt that that book was on home turf for Melbourne in so many ways. It deals with 4 generations of a family, doesn't it? Yeah. Hugh's son is an alcoholic, and he has a pretty tragic relationship with his son, who is pretty central in the book as well. But there's also moments of forgiveness and reconciliation, and very poignant in the book is when Jamie finally reconnects in a kind of a way with his mother, and I think, or am I reading too much, reconnects towards the end with his dad.
Well, I'd always hoped that that book held out the possibility of reconciliation all round. It's not in any sense a book with a happy ending in the traditional sense, but I've never been interested in trying to wrap books up in a happy way. I think that insults readers unless the book was going that way anyway. What you've got to do is open up the possibility of a future that's more enriched because of what happened in the past. And for me, Hugh Bond's death and the grandson's attempt to try and understand their lives was a way of opening up an area of Scottish history which had been closed down before that. That was the beginning of it for me. When I was a child, you could never find a book, a novel, that's to say, written by an Irish immigrant Scottish Catholic. If you wanted to read about a young girl making her first Holy Communion in a town like Kilwinning, which is where we all grew up, you would never have found that. And we lived in a very sectarian society as it was. There was a lot of direct opposition between Catholics and Protestants. We went to a Catholic school. We had Protestant friends, but they went to their school, you went to your school. And of course, a lot of it was expressed through sport, through Celtic and Rangers and Glasgow football, the two Glasgow football teams. There are others, but that was the two that were completely rivalrous, the Old Firm. But there hadn't been the books yet to explain these people's lives, to give a sense of their history into Scotland. And so I used to pore through the shelves as a kid looking to find a novel where I would find a voice in it like my mother's voice, or hear dialogue in the pub that was like the dialogue I knew existed in the pubs in the places where I grew up. Those books didn't exist. So the task was then to write them, to involve yourself in your culture and write those books, put them into history, put them onto the shelves, but not just for Scotland or for people who knew about that world, but for the world. That's what you do as a writer. You're eventually speaking about themes that really matter well beyond your own life, well beyond the lives that you started describing. Because, of course, as you said about the high flats, and it would be true about alcoholism, it would be true about parenting, it would be true about all the things that emerge in that book. It's there in every country you can think of. I was amazed when the book started to be translated into other languages, because I think as a kid wanting to be a writer that was unimaginable, that people in Russia or Japan or China would want to read these books and would understand that these human beings were like them. But that's what it proved in the end, that they were like them, and that explains the life they've had, I think.
Jamie, the fourth generation, is a remarkable character because at a fairly young age he decides that he is not going to be a codependent on the alcoholism of his father, and he actually draws a line in the sand in that relationship dramatically, doesn't he? Yeah. And it really stands on his own 2 feet.
He does, and that's something I'd experienced in life. There are individuals who they have the courage and the wisdom to realise that they're going to make a life for themselves that isn't dependent on what their parents defined life to be. They were going to find life beyond that. They might love their parents, they might recognise them, they might participate in whatever habits and needs they have, but they're also going to do something else, which is to use their own creativity to go a step either beyond or to the side or above or below, but in any event, they're going to move on. And that's sometimes a tragic and sad thing, because it might, in some cases, in that case, it means him leaving his father behind. His father didn't know how to live. That alcoholic father messed up his life and messed up the lives of his children, and the son goes ahead and tries to learn by his example how not to do it. And I think that's something people can recognise sometimes in their own lives, that you can't live a life just slavishly trying to protect your parents from their mistakes.
I'd just like to, because you mentioned Catholic background before, and I would like to mention another wonderful book, Be Near Me, which is the story of a priest who is educated in England at university, and quite a sophisticated and intelligent fellow and cultured. He likes the good things of life, and his mother is a writer. And he is gay and is in a tragic situation with the death of his boyfriend when he's quite young. He doesn't seem ever quite to recover from that. Later, as a priest working in Scotland, in Scotland he is sort of judged for being not quite of the people and never accepted by the parish.
I had a dramatic situation in mind. That book started, not with a voice in the night, but with an actual experience on the street, which was, I went to Manchester because I was interested in these priests that were being hounded out of the parish as paedophiles and so on. This has, of course, been a period of enormous crisis and dismaying news coming out all the time with the Catholic Church. Just dismaying. You can't believe that the Church has protected, abusers in the way that it has, but also you always want to try and see everything from every point of view. If you're any good as a novelist, you're not an editorial writer, you're not an opinionist. You're trying to show, at the deepest level, empathy and activate empathy in the reader. Let them try and look at life in the round. So I went to see what was happening with this mob outside this priest's house, and at Manchester. And I looked up at the window. There was a sort of carnival going on around the house, because that's what happens when people are, are objecting to things. It creates a kind of culture of dissidence, and they hated this priest, and you could practically sell ice creams, and there were Instamatic cameras, and people were having a great day out. But I looked up at the window at one point, and I just saw the curtain go like that and then close. And I realised there was a human being inside that house, fearing for his life, his career in tatters, his faith destroyed, and his own behaviour now holding him to account. And I thought, that's my next novel. That man behind that curtain, I'm going to try and see him in the round. And Father David, who's the central character in Be Near Me, is a deluded figure. He is a man who's been hiding from his sexuality in the Catholic Church, because, of course, the Catholic Church allows you, through the vow of celibacy, to put the question of sex to one side. Marriage and everything's out. So it was a very natural hiding place for a lot of young men in Ireland, Scotland, Italy, Boston, wherever you want to go, Australia, who wanted a life that put their sexuality out of the picture. It's as simple as that, and as tragic as that. And for this priest in particular, the question of his sexuality comes rearing itself back into his life, and the drama of the book was all around that. I felt, in some ways, it's my favourite so far of my books, that, because it was the one where I felt that I distilled so many of the elements of my sense of the world and my sense of Scotland in the world all came together for me in that book, where the priest really, he isn't always likeable. I said before that a character, for me, the great characters in literature, the great characters in Dickens, they're not just lovable, they're kind of baffling and amazing and sometimes annoying. And he had, to me, so many sides to him. And I loved the idea of trying to just get the reader to understand this terrible sort of conundrum that was going on.
And this book shares with the Bulger essay and so much of your writing the ability to see, as you said just now, to see through different sets of eyes, even those that other people don't want to see through. And in this case, it's the eyes of a priest who has a relationship with a teenage boy.
Well, it's not so much a relationship. He kisses him once on the cheek. And that was a very deliberate thing. This priest is not a paedophile. He's a gay man who's not gone about his life in the right way. And he does get into a compromising situation late at night, encouraging a young drinking boy on the estate. I mean, I knew that estate so well from my childhood. The place in that book is so clear to anybody who reads it. It is Pennyburn. It's the place where I grew up, where so many, there's a couple of people in the audience tonight, John and Karen Cassidy. I want to give a shout to them. They came, and my brother Michael is here as well, from Scotland, and they know very well what that community was like. And it's full of love, as well as some of the things I'm mentioning. It was a good place to grow up, but the idea of a priest being in a priest house at 4 o'clock in the morning with bottles of cider and kissing him in the cheek would have caused the outrage that it does cause in the novel. But I wanted the reader, again, to deal with the moral problem. What does this mean? What did he actually do? What is the crime? What is my prejudice in this? Is there a way to really... Because I think newspapers slightly pollute people's minds. Do you know that? I think you're all a bit bigger than what newspapers offer you. And if I can just say, I know we're going to questions, but if the novelist has got one big task left in these times, it is to, in some sense, complement the size of your imagination, not to undernourish it or to insult it, as the newspapers, I think, sometimes do. They're content to feed you bile and ideology and opinion in place of human understanding. So I would say if there's one role the novelist still has, it will be to try to oppose the newspapers in that way.